finally, sir, that no strategy in a country where 70% of people live in rural India can succeed if we do not pay adequate attention to agriculture and to rural development. These are the 6 objectives against the background of which this budget ought to be judged. On the first point, sir, we have reduced the fiscal deficit from 8.5% in 1991 to roughly 5.1% in the last year, and to we further propose to reduce it to 4.7% of GDP. This is very important if we take anti-inflationary stance of our policy seriously. And inflation, as the experience of the last 3 years has shown, hurts the poor the most. Therefore, if we care about social justice, we must control inflation. And to control inflation, it is necessary to control fiscal deficit further. Sir, several members, honorable members, have pointed out that revenue deficit is still very high. In my budget speech, I shared the concern of the honorable members with the fact that we have not been able to reduce the revenue deficit to the level that it ought to be reduced. But there are certain compulsions. The very fact that interest rates are such a heavy burden and such a heavy component of the revenue deficit, this problem can be resolved, but only in the medium term, over a period of 2 to 3 years. If every year we contain the fiscal deficit, I feel confident by 95-96, the interest payments would reach a plateau, and thereby the revenue deficit would come under control. Another point that I do want to point out, that sometimes the revenue deficit is inflated because of the accounting conventions that we adopt in this country. For example, a very large proportion of the central plan in this country consists of expenditure which is in the revenue account. The whole of rural development program, the whole of agricultural development program, the whole of money that the central government spends on education, on health and family planning, all this appears in the revenue budget. And yet we all know that many of these activities do create durable assets. When you look at this whole thing in that perspective, I venture to think that the revenue deficit, though it needs to be reduced, we don't have to take such an alarmistic account of the present revenue deficit. Sir, in the course of the debate, Shri Jaswant Singh ji brought up the question of the adjustment, and he quoted from a particular document from Mr. Rosenthal, an old friend of mine who presently is the Executive Secretary of ECLA. I obviously feel that it's partly because of lack of knowledge about Latin America that Shri Jaswant Singh ji chose to quote what happened in Latin America with our own experience. Today, the whole world is convinced that if you have the smoothest going program of adjustment come structural change, it is the Indian program. We have avoided in this country, the misery, the unemployment, the inflation, the social and economic chaos that prevailed in Latin America in the 1980s, which led to Latin America being described, in the 80s being described for Latin America and large part of Africa, a lost decade. We have avoided India getting into that sort of dangerous situation. In the first year itself, the national income grew. But in the second year, we have ensured that the national income would grow at a healthy 4% of the 4% per annum. And in the current years, if weather gods are normal, I expect the economy will grow at least by 5% and thereafter move at a much faster pace. So therefore, comparing India with Latin America or with Africa, I would submit to Shri Jaswant Singh ji is not a fair comparison. Now, Several members have pointed out to the price situation. When we started, we were in the midst of a double-digit inflation. Inflation reached as high as a point of 17% on a point-to-point basis. Today, we are in a situation where the annual rate of inflation is no more than 6.4%. Now, we may quibble about the various indices of measuring inflation, but every single index shows the steep fall in the inflation rate. If you look at the consumer price index for industrial workers, the latest index that I have is for the month of February. It shows an annual inflation rate lower than the inflation rate shown by the wholesale price index, that is 5.7%. If you look at the consumer price index for agricultural laborers, yes, if you look at the agricultural laborers index, the latest index that I have for the month of January, it shows an increase of no more than 5%. Now, this comparison between the point-to-point and average, I am confident that the averages you compare hereafter in this year would show a steep fall. Even now, if you compare the averages for the current year with the preceding year, on any conceivable index, they show a significant fall. Therefore, the improvement that has taken place in the price situation is a fact of life. The fact that after the presentation of the budget, prices of several commodities have in fact fallen is a fact of life, even though some honorable members might not like to admit that this has happened. Sir, several members have used the budget debate to talk about the process of import liberalization. Shri Jaswant Singh ji referred to the process of globalization. I could not really understand what he meant, because in the same breath he said that his party supports the integration of India with the world economy, but somehow it opposes globalization. Now, let me explain what is our concept of globalization. I do want to state categorically that when we talk of globalization, it does not in any way mean surrendering India's economic sovereignty. When we talk of globalization, we mean a strategy of economic development which will improve the productivity and technological capacity of this nation so that it can look straight in the eye even the most powerful nation in the world. Ours is a strategy of self-reliance, not surrendering our sovereignty or our interest to foreign countries. And I submit to you that we live in a world of interdependence. And that in this interdependent world, now, if we live in this world of interdependence, and therefore, the only way in which India's full development potential can be realized is by taking advantage of the international division of labor, that is by pushing our exports. India is a large country, but we do not often recognize that on a per capita basis, India is not as well endowed in terms of natural resources as we believe. If India's full development potential is to be realized, India must become a major trading nation of the world. And if we want to become a major trading nation of the world, exports have to grow. This pessimism that has prevailed in this country for a long period of time, that somehow India cannot compete, that somehow we are inferior to other countries, I think is thoroughly misplaced. We must look at what's happening in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Singapore, leave aside Korea, and even smaller nations, when they have made up their mind, they have shown that it is the domestic capabilities which is the biggest single barrier to growth of export. That is certainly the case with India. When I look at India and China, I think Shri Nirmal Chatterjee brought up the case of China. Shri Nirmal Chatterjee brought up the case of China. In 1973, if you look at India's exports and China's exports, they were roughly of the same order of about $13 billion. We have reached from 1973, 20 years later, to about $18 billion. The Chinese exports have exceeded $50 billion. And that's why China is taken very seriously. Next to Japan, the United States has the largest deficit in its trade with China. And that's why the Chinese sensitivities, Chinese concerns are taken note of in the world. If India wants to be taken seriously, if India wants to be a major player in the world, then we have no alternative but to have a forward-looking export sector. That does not mean a philosophy of subjugation. That is truly a philosophy of self-reliance. Some members in the course of the debate argued that we have opened our doors to a flood of imports. Obviously, these members, I say it in all humility, have not looked at the facts. If you look at India's import bill, and if you leave out oil imports, India's imports in dollar terms are lower in 92-93 than they were in 1989-90. The fact that we have removed bureaucratic controls through which India's foreign trade was being regulated does not mean that we are going to open our country to indiscriminate import of foreign goods.